a Pittsburgh filmmaker working far outside Hollywood, once made a sequel to his own zombie movie and ended up with something closer to scripture for horror fans. George Romero's Dawn of the Dead arrived in 1978 as a template, a satire, and a line in the sand the genre still hasn't fully crossed. So when Universal greenlit a remake for 2004, fronted by a first-time feature director and a writer best known for low-budget oddities, the reaction was almost unanimous. The remake was finished before it started. What followed was stranger than anyone expected. Sprinting undead, rewritten characters, a brutal cold open, and quiet bows to the original that almost nobody caught the first time around. Number 1. The remake nobody wanted. For most horror fans in the early 2000s, the announcement read like an obituary. Universal was greenlighting a remake of Dawn of the Dead, the 1978 satire that had already settled into its own kind of permanence. The original wasn't just a popular horror film, but the rare zombie movie taken seriously by mainstream critics, taught in film classes, and dissected for its mall imagery and its read on consumer culture. Anything that touched it carried the weight of a cover version touching a sacred recording. The suspicion ran deeper than the usual remake fatigue. By 2003, the studios were already pulling apart slasher classics and dumping them back into multiplexes with new gloss and not much else. Most landed somewhere between hollow and embarrassing. A remake of Romero's Mall film, made by a director with no features behind him and a screenwriter who had cut his teeth on Troma's lowest budget horror, looked like the next entry on that ledger before a single frame had been shot. What the suspicion missed was that the people making the new film were not pretending Romero's version didn't exist. They knew. They had also decided very early that a polite remake would be the worst possible outcome, and that the smarter play was to make a film loud enough to argue with. The first decision the production made was choosing the person who would take the heat for that approach, and almost nobody knew his name yet. Number 2. Snyder's first big gamble. By the early 2000s, Zack Snyder had built a reputation in two industries that didn't usually open Hollywood doors. His commercials had pulled awards and Super Bowl slots, and his music videos had given him a sleek, hyper-confident visual signature. What he didn't have was a feature film. When Universal handed him Dawn of the Dead as his debut, the polish that came with his background looked like a gift on paper and a problem in practice. The visual command was real. Snyder could shoot a scene quickly, light it with confidence, and frame action in ways most first-time feature directors needed years to learn. The questions sitting under all of that were the ones commercials never tested. Could he sustain story over 90 minutes? Could he hold a performance? Could he keep an audience invested in characters once the slow-motion shots stopped doing the work for him? Studio veterans assumed at least one of those answers would be no. Snyder seemed aware of the trap, and he buried a small private joke about it inside the film. In Anna's opening scenes, the television in the background plays one of his own commercials. The director, who supposedly couldn't tell a story, spent his first feature putting his commercial work in the corner of the frame, where it could only be noticed by viewers who already knew what to look for. Number 3. Re-envisioning, not copying. The smartest decision the production made was the one that contradicted everything fans expected. Rather than rebuild Romero's film scene by scene, the team agreed that the new movie would keep only the spine of the original. Survivors, maul, collapse, and rebuild every other layer from scratch. The pace would change, the rules of the undead would change, the character dynamics, the humor, the score, the color palette, the way danger arrived inside a frame, all of it would be built fresh for an audience that had grown up on faster, glossier filmmaking. The phrase that circulated on set was that they were re-envisioning the picture, not copying it. That distinction sounds small written down, but it shaped every controversial choice the final film would later defend. A respectful copy would have aged into a footnote, the sort of remake referenced briefly in articles about the original and forgotten everywhere else. The 2004 version aged into something the genre is still working through, a reference point that critics, fans, and filmmakers continue to cite when they want to make a case about what a remake can or cannot do. That is the outcome the team set out to engineer, and the strange achievement of the picture is that they got it without most viewers ever realizing they were trying. Number 4. Gunn rewired the story. The strangest thing about the script that landed on Snyder's desk wasn't the zombies, but the people. James Gunn had been hired off the back of a Troma resume that didn't exactly suggest character drama, and the general expectation was that he would deliver a competent, lean, disposable horror script that hit the genre beats and got out clean. What he turned in instead was something almost old-fashioned. Every survivor had an interior life. The nurse arriving home to a normal evening had a real marriage and a real job that informed how she would later think under pressure. The security veteran had a private resentment he carried into every interaction. The salesman's swagger was a thin paint job over genuine fear. The married pair were already on the edge of something quieter and worse than the apocalypse. Gunn wrote pressure into the script before the undead showed up, and the pressure stayed when they did. The humor came from the same place. Characters cracked jokes the way exhausted people do, not the way movie characters do when a screenwriter wants the audience to relax. The result was a script that did barely any obvious work for itself. The famous set pieces, the running undead, the credit sequence, the mall iconography would dominate the conversation around the film. Gunn's contribution was the layer underneath, the layer few viewers noticed because it was working as designed. By the time the film opened, audiences who couldn't have named the screenwriter were nevertheless responding to the part of the movie that was most clearly his. Number 5. The sprint that split fans. On-screen, Romero's zombies had always shuffled. They were patient, slow, and conceptually inseparable from the satire of the original, a tide that couldn't be hurried because the horror was what the tide meant. In the 2004 remake, they sprinted, they charged, they rounded corners and crossed parking lots and slammed against glass with a physical fury the genre had not seen at this scale on a major American screen. The decision belonged primarily to Snyder, and it functioned as the remake's loudest creative stamp. A slow zombie remake would have been an act of preservation. A fast zombie remake announced before any character spoke that this version intended to feel different at the level of pure motion. Audiences clocked the change in seconds. Some of them loved it for the shock of it. Others felt the movie had broken the rule that gave the original its meaning. The argument hardened quickly, and it has never fully softened. Defenders pointed out that the new pace served a story about a world collapsing inside a single afternoon, where slow undead would have read as a logistical impossibility. Critics countered that the speed traded thematic depth for adrenaline and that no amount of glossy filmmaking could substitute for the original's patience. Both sides were arguing about more than the zombies. They were arguing about what the genre was for. It is the kind of argument that doesn't resolve, only repeats with each new entry, and the 2004 film has remained a reference point in it ever since. Number 6. Opening that declares war. The first images of the new film are quiet and deceptively domestic. Sunlight on a hospital corridor, a checklist on a clipboard, a nurse's shift ending the way 10,000 other shifts have ended. Anna drives home through ordinary streets, exchanges ordinary affection with her husband, and falls asleep next to him in an ordinary bed. The film is teaching the audience the texture of normal, so it can take it apart. When the neighbor's daughter appears in the bedroom doorway, the movie makes its first declaration of intent. The encounter is short, brutal, and shot without flinching, and it ends Anna's husband within seconds of the audience meeting him. By the time Anna makes it outside, her street is already burning. Cars are crashing. Strangers are tearing into other strangers on lawns where suburban geometry insists this is not supposed to be happening. The remake does not give Anna, or the audience, a single beat in which to process what is going on. That refusal to slow down is the chapter's whole purpose. Most horror films treat the cold open as a tease, a flicker of menace before the real story sets up its rules and characters. The 2004 movie treats it as a mission statement. This world is gone, the rules have already collapsed, and any remaining sense of safety is on a clock the audience cannot see. By the time Anna finds her way to a building that seems to promise shelter, the rules of where she's headed will feel just as fragile as the streets she's leaving behind. Number 7. Crossroads Mall was rebuilt. In 2003, the production walked into a Toronto area shopping center that had been declared functionally dead. The mall standing in for the fictional Crossroads had emptied out enough that the production could effectively take the building over for an extended shoot. That kind of access on the kind of timeline a studio horror needed was rare to the point of being a fluke. It was the first piece of luck the remake had, and the team treated it like the storytelling resource it was. The location was emptied, redressed, restocked, and relit until it became a fully functional fictional mall. Stores were given consumer-recognizable signage, including invented brands designed to feel real on screen. Window displays were stocked with merchandise, so the camera could pull through any space without exposing the illusion. Sightlines were planned so the survivors could make every kind of move audiences associate with mall geography. Long retreats down corridors, vertical escapes up escalators, dead-end pockets where character beats could play. The production was building a working set piece, not just a backdrop. The choice mattered because a mall is a deeply specific kind of space. It is designed to make people feel safe, comfortable, and gently encouraged to spend. That comfort is what the original had used as satire, and the remake needed the comfort layer to function before it could be inverted into a trap. Crossroads had to look like the kind of place a viewer might genuinely enjoy being lost in. Only then could the slow realization that there is nothing meaningful inside it land with the right weight. By the time the cast moved through the location, the mall had become a character in its own right. It promised shelter, then retracted the promise. It offered abundance, then revealed how little of that abundance mattered when survival, not consumption, was the goal. Every chapter of the film that takes place inside Crossroads carries the production design work invisibly, the way a good set always does. The audience does not notice the mall, they notice the people trying to live inside it, which is the highest compliment the production could have hoped to earn. Number 8. Gore done the hard way. The first thing visitors to the makeup trailer noticed was how physical the work was. Foam latex pieces drying on shelves, casts of actors' faces in open trays, wound prosthetics laid out by limb and intensity. The team running effects on the remake had decided early that the horror would be carried, wherever possible, by something the camera could literally see and an actor could literally wear. The film's reputation for shocking imagery was built on that decision. Headshot effects, body damage, late-stage decay, and the running undead's accumulated injuries were primarily practical. Performers were caked in textured prosthetics, so close-up framing could land without losing tactile credibility. Digital work was used where physical effects would have been impossible or unsafe. An impossible drop in light, a digital cleanup pass on a rig, a punctured skull exit angle that no practical setup could safely deliver. The principle was that the digital layer existed to support the physical illusion rather than replace it. Audiences could feel the difference, even if they could not name it. The pace of the filmmaking would otherwise have argued against this approach. Snyder shot fast, often with multiple cameras, and a fully digital horror pass would have removed entire layers of friction from his schedule. The decision to keep the gore physical was a deliberate trade. Slower setups, longer makeup chairs, more on-set discomfort, in exchange for a film whose violence still feels heavy years later. The single longest morning on set, by some accounts, involved nothing more than getting one wound to look correct in a single shot. Proof of how seriously the production took the texture of its own horror. Number 9. Credits written in blood. The credits arrive after the cold open ends and Anna has driven through her collapsing neighborhood. They open with shaky news footage, hospital corridors crowded beyond capacity, panicked broadcasts from countries the audience has not been shown, and bodies moving through public spaces in ways no normal newsreel ever framed them. Over all of it plays Johnny Cash's The Man Comes Around, a track the artist released near the end of his career, and which carries a kind of biblical end-of-days weight that no purpose-built score could have manufactured. The choice was a gamble. Cash had only just died when the film entered post-production, and using one of his late career recordings for a horror title sequence carried a risk of feeling tasteless if it landed badly. The way it actually plays in the finished film is closer to liturgical. The song's pace creates a strange dignity around imagery that would otherwise read as exploitation. The credits don't feel like they're decorating the apocalypse, they feel like they're announcing it. Functionally, the sequence is doing work no other part of the film could afford to spend time on. The story proper is going to confine itself to a small group of survivors trapped inside a mall. Without the credits, the audience would never see what was happening to the rest of the world. The credits give the outbreak global scale by implication. Collapsed cities, overwhelmed responders, religious reactions, military reactions, ordinary people losing the thread. By the time the film hands the audience back to Anna on the freeway, the scope is set. The other thing the credits do is calibrate tone. Most horror remakes use their title sequence as a brand placeholder, a few seconds of stylized text. This one treats the title sequence as a mood-setting tool with a job to do. By the time the song ends, the audience has been told, without anyone saying it aloud, that this is not going to be a film with comforting answers. The credits are the second contract the remake signs with the viewer, and the contract is honored for the rest of the runtime. Number 10. Keep the plague unexplained. Most outbreak films feel obliged to explain themselves. A virus name, a leaked sample, a government cover-up, a patient zero, a scientist, with the answer mid-flight. The 2004 remake takes none of those exits. Whatever has caused the dead to walk and bite is never given a name, an origin, or a clean piece of medical logic. It is simply happening, and it is happening faster than anyone on screen can think. The choice runs against modern blockbuster instinct, which usually treats mystery as a problem to solve rather than a tone to maintain. By skipping the origin story, the remake also skips the entire mid-film exposition act most outbreak movies sit through. There is no convenient broadcast that explains the science. There is no rescued scientist who knows how this started. There is barely an attempt to model the infection beyond bite and turn, and even that is treated as observational rather than authoritative. The world is collapsing, and the people inside it are not in a position to ask why. What this leaves behind is a story whose horror works at the level of helplessness rather than explanation. The audience can't get ahead of the survivors because there is no information to get ahead with. Panic stays current, confusion stays useful. The film keeps its forward momentum because no character ever has to pause and explain a discovery. Whether the remake's silence is artistic restraint, narrative pragmatism, or both at once is a question the film itself never answers, and that refusal is exactly the answer it wants the viewer to leave with. Number 11. Anna wasn't a scream queen. On paper, Anna could have read like any other horror film lead, pretty, terrified, screaming. On screen, Sarah Polley plays her almost in the opposite register. Anna is competent, contained, and quietly precise from the first scene, and the precision survives the film's worst moments. When the world collapses, she does not become a different person. She becomes a more focused version of the same one. The character's nursing background is part of why this works. Polley plays Anna as someone whose default mode is responding to emergencies, rather than panicking through them. She moves with practical economy. She prioritizes. She catches herself at the moments most actors would let a character break. The performance is built out of hundreds of small choices that add up to a survivor whose calm is a habit, not a personality trait. The chaos around her gets to feel more extreme because her reactions stay calibrated. Polley was already an unusual fit for studio horror by the time she signed on. She had built her reputation on independent films and was openly skeptical of mainstream Hollywood. Taking the project was not the obvious next step for her, and she has been candid in interviews about treating the role as a deliberate experiment in what she could bring to a genre she had no particular history with. What ended up on screen is the calmest, most grounded center the film has, and it is the reason the chaos around it ever feels heavy enough to matter. Number 12. The Gun Shop Bond. A whiteboard, a dry erase marker, and a few hundred meters of open air separate the survivors in the mall from Andy in the gun shop. The remake's most quietly devastating idea is built out of those three objects. Andy can't leave his rooftop. The mall group can't reach him. The only communication available to them is a slow exchange of words held up in handwriting across the gap. Watching it work is one of the strangest emotional experiences the film offers. The friendship grows through that distance. Kenneth, the security veteran with the steadiest nerves in the mall, becomes Andy's primary correspondent. The exchanges start practical, requests for ammunition, weather notes, observations about zombie movement on the streets between them. Then they get personal. Andy starts asking after the people he can see through binoculars. The mall group starts answering. By the time the bond is established, neither man has heard the other's voice, and the audience has been pulled into a relationship the film is built primarily out of patience. What makes the thread devastating is the asymmetry. The mall group has supplies, options, and time. Andy has none of those things. His food is running low. His ammunition is finite. The undead never stop accumulating around the building he cannot leave. Every whiteboard message exchanged with Kenneth is also a message about a clock the audience can see ticking down. The film does not rush the chapter to a clean ending. It lets the bond exist, lets the danger compound, and lets the gap between the two men remain literal as well as emotional. Whatever happens to Andy in the end is not the point. The point is what the weight costs everyone watching, and the film refuses to release that pressure even when the practical story moves on. Number 13. Satire in a shinier package. The most common complaint about the 2004 remake is that it abandoned Romero's social commentary. The mall in this version is no longer a satirical statement. It is just a mall. The undead shoppers, the racks of merchandise, the consumer iconography that made the original a punchline aimed at a culture in formation, all of it is supposed to have been hollowed out for a film interested only in adrenaline. The complaint is mostly fair. It is also not the whole picture. What the remake does have is a different kind of self-awareness, one that fits the era it was made in. By 2004, the world Romero had been satirizing in 1978 had simply won. Consumer culture was no longer a creeping threat to be diagnosed. It was the air everyone breathed. A film made in that environment couldn't usefully repeat the original's argument, because the argument had been settled in the wrong direction. What the new movie does instead is treat the mall as a default rather than a critique. Glossy, frictionless, comforting in ways the survivors initially welcome before the comfort starts to feel like sedation. Characters use the retail space the way modern audiences actually use malls, half ironically and half gratefully, and the film is observant enough to register both. Whether that counts as satire is the live question. Defenders argue that the remake's commercialism is its commentary, that its shiny surface is the indictment the moment called for. Critics argue that without an explicit thesis, the surface is just a surface. Both readings have weight. The remake either has too much commentary baked in for a horror remake of its era, or not enough, depending entirely on how much credit a viewer is willing to extend to a film that spends most of its runtime on running zombies. Number 14. Goodbye, Zombie Dogs. For weeks during the script and storyboard process, the production seriously entertained an idea that came close to making the final film, a supply run sequence built around trained dogs, with at least some of the dogs eventually turning. The notion had a logic to it. Trained animals could move through hostile streets faster than humans, carry packs, and create one of the few realistic ways for the survivors to get supplies into the mall without dying for them. The trouble was that every conversation about the sequence kept inflating it. Animal training, stunt coordination, specialized effects, insurance, a separate creature design for the turned dogs, and beneath the logistics, the suspicion that introducing a major non-human element would tilt the film away from the human survival story it had been carefully built around. The idea was eventually dropped, regretted briefly, and then quietly missed for the right reasons. Sometimes the most interesting cut content is the cut content that would have worked, but worked at the cost of the film working as a whole. The dogs never made it onto the streets, and the streets are better for it. Number 15. The Zombie Baby Line. There is a sequence in the second half of the film that, depending on the viewer, is either the moment the remake earned its reputation or the moment it lost the room. A surviving woman in the group is pregnant when she's bitten. The film does not look away from what that means. It follows the pregnancy through her decline, through her death, and through what comes after. And the chapter pushes into territory most studio horror would have flinched away from at the script stage. Watching it for the first time is a specific experience. It does not feel like the film is reaching for shock. It feels like the film has decided that if the world it has built is real, this is one of the things that would happen in it, and the audience has to live with that decision. The reaction it provoked split along the line you would expect. Some viewers came out of the film unable to talk about anything else. Others felt the sequence was a step too far, a gross-out flexing for its own sake, the moment the remake's instincts ran past good judgment. Both responses are honest. The sequence does not flinch, and asking a viewer not to flinch back is asking a lot. What stayed with me watching it again years after release was how quiet the film gets in the moments around the worst of it. The score thins, the camera holds rather than cuts. There is no triumphant beat afterward. The movie does not tell the audience how to feel, and it does not try to recover the room before pressing on. Whether that counts as bravery, calculation, or recklessness is a question every viewer answers differently, and the film seems entirely comfortable letting them. Number 16. One song, two sick jokes. On paper, the same song appearing twice in a horror film at completely different volumes shouldn't work. In practice, the remake uses "Down with the Sickness" as one of its sharpest tonal weapons. Mid-film, Richard Cheese's lounge piano cover plays in the mall during a sequence of survivors testing each other's nerve, and the track becomes a piece of dark comedy. End credits. Disturbed's original metal version slams in over the closing imagery, and the same song becomes a release valve for everything the film has just done to the audience. One title, two opposite registers, both calculated. The cover version is doing the more interesting work. Cheese's reinterpretation is genuinely funny, and dropping it into the mall sequence gives the survivors something close to unbearable, a moment of cocktail bar normality inside a building they cannot leave alive. The joke is that the song is comforting in form and aggressive in lyric, and the film knows the audience will register both layers at once. By the time the survivors are doing on screen what the song's title suggests, the mood has flipped from grim to grimly entertaining without anything else changing in the scene. The closing credits version functions in the opposite direction. By that point, the film has spent nearly 2 hours grinding the audience down. Disturbed's original recording does not reassure anybody. It leans into the bleakness, doubles it, and lets the viewer leave on a hostile note rather than a comforting one. Johnny Cash had handled the apocalyptic opening, and the studio had clearly decided not to repeat that register in the close. The film ends the way it began, with a song that knew exactly what kind of mood it was carrying. It just ended on the angrier one. Number 17. Romero DNA Everywhere. At least 3 actors from George Romero's original Dawn of the Dead appear inside the 2004 remake, hidden in plain sight. Ken Foree, who played the protagonist Peter in the 1978 film, appears as a televangelist whose broadcast plays on a screen during the early chaos. Tom Savini, the original's makeup effects mastermind and the actor behind the lead biker, appears as a sheriff issuing a public address about the outbreak. Scott Reiniger, who played Roger in the original, appears as a general giving a televised briefing. 3 legacy cast members, 3 different broadcast roles, 3 quiet boos to the film the remake had been accused of disrespecting before it began. The cameos are not the only signal. Store names inside the mall include nods to the original's production team, and background businesses carry inside joke signage that only deeply familiar viewers catch on first pass. Specific shot compositions echo specific Romero moments without copying them outright. Small staging choices mirror beats from the 1978 film at angles oblique enough that mainstream audiences read them as new, while veterans read them as tribute. The remake had decided early, as the first chapter of this list noted, that a polite imitation would be the worst possible outcome. What it did instead was bury its respect in the texture of the film, where casual viewers would not notice it and devoted fans would. There is a structural reason for the strategy. The remake could not safely lean into homage as a primary tone, because doing so would have undercut the energetic modernized film it was trying to be. If every scene paused to acknowledge Romero, the new movie's identity would have collapsed back into the old one. By burying the references, the production got both registers at once: a forward-leaning horror film for the multiplex audience, and a heavily annotated love letter for the kind of viewer who could pause a frame and find the joke. The sum is a film that argues with Romero's version on the surface and bows to it underneath, and few remakes manage either move cleanly. Number 18. An ending with no escape. For about 10 minutes near the end of the film, the remake offers what looks like a clean exit. The surviving group has built a plan, made it onto a boat, and is heading toward an island the dialogue has framed as a possible refuge. The score swells into something close to triumphant. The cinematography finds open water and open sky. Everything in the language of mainstream genre cinema says the audience is being released from the pressure they have been carrying for 2 hours. And then, the film throws that release out a window in the harshest way it knows. The credits begin. The audience starts to relax. And underneath the credits, in handheld camcorder footage shot by one of the surviving characters, the journey goes wrong. The boat reaches the island. The island is overrun. The footage degrades into chaos as the survivors are attacked, scattered, and almost certainly finished off, and the film stops without confirming any of their fates in dialogue or score. The triumphant exit was not an exit at all. It was a setup the credits dismantle in real time. Cruelty is the right word for the technique. Most films that withhold a happy ending do so by simply not providing one. The remake provides one, watches the audience accept it, and then snatches it away after they have already started leaving the emotional room. It is a structural double cross, and it is why the ending lingers. The film's final argument is that escape was always an illusion, that the world the cold open established was never going to admit anyone back into safety, and that the audience itself was being set up alongside the characters. There is no resolution at the end of the credits, only the noise cutting out. That, the film suggests, is the only honest ending available. Number 19. The preview that sold it. In the days before opening weekend, Universal made a marketing decision that few studio horror releases had attempted at scale. The first 10 minutes of the film, the cold open, the suburban collapse, and Anna's escape onto the freeway were aired uncut on cable as a preview promotion. Viewers who tuned in expecting a teaser got the full sequence: practical gore, sprinting undead, the works. The bet was simple and borderline reckless. The studio had decided that the strongest argument the film could make for itself was the film itself, and that handing over its single best 10 minutes to free television would draw more ticket sales than it canceled. The bet paid out within days. People who watched the preview talked about it. People who heard about it tuned in for the next airing. Tickets moved on the strength of word of mouth that started before the film was technically in theaters. By the time the weekend opened, the studio had effectively given the film away in advance, and the trick of the strategy was that the giveaway worked, because the opening sequence was the kind of opening sequence designed to make people want the rest. Number 20. Acclaimed but still contested. The early reviews of the remake fell into two camps that have never fully reconciled. On one side, critics praised the film's pacing, energy, performances, and willingness to commit to its own brutal instincts. The remake was described in multiple major outlets as competent in ways most horror remakes were not, well acted in ways the genre rarely required, and tonally controlled in ways that flattered both the director and the screenwriter. The praise was real, and the box office performance reinforced it. On the other side, a vocal block of critics felt the film had failed at the only thing that mattered. The 1978 original had been a satire dressed in horror, and the 2004 version had stripped the satire out and kept only the horror. To these reviewers, no amount of slick filmmaking could substitute for the conceptual depth the original had offered. The remake was a polished surface where its predecessor had carried meaning. The two readings often appeared on the same week's review pages, and they often used similar adjectives to opposite ends. What makes the critical record unusual is that neither side has surrendered the position. The remake has aged into a film that skeptics still concede is well made, and that admirers still concede is shallower than the original. Praise and criticism coexist in the film's reputation rather than canceling each other out. That is unusual for a studio horror release, and it is part of why the conversation around the film never quite ended. Most genre films are either rehabilitated or forgotten with time. This one has been neither. It is still the same argument decades later, with the same camps using the same evidence and reaching the same opposing conclusions. Number 21. It helped revive zombies. In the early 2000s, the zombie genre was already in motion before the remake arrived. Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later had reached international audiences in 2002 and 2003 with infected attackers that ran, sprinted, and behaved more like rabid animals than the slow undead the genre had standardized on. Resident Evil had brought a video game pedigree to multiplexes in 2002. Several straight-to-video and international productions were quietly experimenting with faster, more aggressive undead behavior. The undercurrent was already moving, but it had not yet reached American multiplex horror at full volume. What the 2004 remake did was carry that undercurrent into the center of the studio system at the moment the genre needed a flagship. The film's opening weekend, its critical attention, and its audience reach pushed the new fast zombie register into a place where it was no longer a stylistic novelty, but a serious commercial template. Studio executives who had previously assumed zombie films were a niche product saw a remake of a 1978 movie open at number 1. Greenlights followed, so did imitations, both honest and cynical. Within a few years, fast and aggressive undead were a default option for new zombie projects rather than an alternative to the slow Romero tradition. The remake did not invent the modern zombie wave by itself, and it did not arrive in isolation either. What it did was act as the connective tissue between the indie and international experiments that preceded it and the broader American genre revival that followed. Television, video games, comics, and feature production all began treating the zombie story as a flexible commercial framework rather than a fading horror subgenre. The remake's role in that shift is not the whole story. It is the load-bearing middle of it, the entry that proved a major studio could put running zombies in front of a Friday night audience and have the audience not only show up but come back next week with friends. Number 22. Romero's complicated verdict. It was an action film. It was a really good action film, but it lost its meaning. George A. Romero said variations of that line in multiple interviews after the 2004 remake came out, and the line has become the defining shorthand for his complicated reaction to it. Romero was the one person whose verdict the production could never escape, because he was the architect of the original and the person against whose vision the remake would always be measured. What he praised was specific. The opening sequence, in particular, drew genuine admiration from him. He talked openly about how effective the cold open was as a piece of action filmmaking, how cleanly Snyder had set up the world's collapse, and how skillfully the early stretch handled the suburban to apocalyptic shift. For a filmmaker famous for protecting his own work, that level of public credit had real weight, and it complicates any simple reading of his stance. The praise was only ever part of what he had to say, however. What he didn't admire was the same thing many of his fans didn't admire. The original had been a film about something, and the remake had, in his reading, traded that something for kinetic energy. He was not interested in pretending otherwise. He spoke about it with the directness of someone who had spent his entire career arguing that horror could carry social weight and who now saw a successful remake of his most famous film hand the genre back to spectacle. The respect and the disappointment lived side by side in his interviews, often in the same paragraph. That balance is why his verdict matters more than almost anyone else's. A wholesale rejection from Romero would have been easy to dismiss as protectiveness. A wholesale endorsement would have been hard to believe. What he gave instead was a careful split decision, and as he summarized it in one interview, they did a good job, just not the job I would have done. The remake had earned his admiration as filmmaking, and it had failed to earn his agreement as art, and Romero had no interest in pretending those were the same thing. Number 23. The film launched Snyder. A first-time feature director with a commercials background was, in the early 2000s, the least likely person to be handed the keys to a major studio franchise. By the late 2000s, Snyder had been handed at least 2 of them. The remake did not just survive its release, as the second chapter of this list set up. It became the project that opened nearly every door that followed, in a Hollywood that had spent the previous decade being skeptical of directors with his exact resume. The film's commercial performance was the first signal. Studios pay attention when a debut feature opens at number 1, and the remake's opening weekend numbers translated quickly into Snyder being treated as a director who could handle scale. His next project, 300, was a stylistic showcase that confirmed the visual confidence had been real. Watchmen followed, with all the studio risk that came with it. By the time he was attached to a Superman reboot, the conversation had completely flipped. The director, who had been a question mark in 2003, was now considered a known quantity for projects that would have terrified most studios to hand over. There is an irony in the trajectory that fans still notice. The film that launched Snyder is, for many of his admirers, still the one with the cleanest discipline. The blockbuster instincts were already there. The visual command was already there. What was also there, and what arguably became less consistent in his later work, was the constraint of a tight horror runtime, a small cast, and a contained location. The remake had to be efficient. That efficiency is what made it land. The director who built his career on the back of it has been chasing different problems ever since, and a fair number of viewers still consider the first one his best at solving. Number 24. Home video deepened the myth. The film's afterlife on home video did something most theatrical hits never quite managed. The DVD release brought an unrated cut with extended horror sequences, restored character beats, and a deeper texture for moments that had been compressed in the theatrical pass. Bonus features expanded the world further, including additional material around Andy in the gun shop that gave his thread the weight the runtime hadn't fully allowed. Behind-the-scenes featurettes, deleted scenes, and effects breakdowns turned the package into something closer to a fan's archive than a standard genre disc. Word of mouth among horror viewers shifted accordingly. The remake stopped being a hit and started being a repeat watch object, the kind of film that benefits from rewatches because the home video version had been built to reward them. By the time streaming made the movie available with a few clicks, it had already accumulated the kind of cult reputation most horror remakes spend their entire lives failing to earn. The studio did not engineer that ascent. The disc did the work, one rewatch at a time, and the film's myth grew quietly underneath the noise. The 2004 Dawn of the Dead remains one of the few modern horror remakes that made its case in the only way that actually works. It refused to be polite. It kept its respect for Romero buried where the noise wouldn't reach it, and it bet that an audience would forgive a fast zombie redirect if the film around the redirect was actually well made. That bet held. The remake is still a reference point in the conversation about what a horror remake can be, and its biggest secret may be that it earned its place by changing exactly enough to feel dangerous, without ever cutting the line back to the original. If this kind of breakdown is the kind of thing you find yourself returning to, the like and subscribe buttons are the easiest way to make sure the next one lands in your feed. And before you go, there is a question worth thinking about. Do you prefer Romero's original or Snyder's remake? The disagreement has been running for over 20 years now, and the comments are exactly where it lives.